thank you, Armando, for this kind invitation. Been our major interlocutor. It's a delight to be here with you in Montreal. So I will start off with something that I think is going to be a little counterintuitive in a session devoted to Izutsu and his work, because what I am going to be talking about today is where I think he stopped and where maybe the woman, the Sufi poet that I'm going to talk about today, maybe picks up. Can I reach without destroying you? Thank you. Great. In 1997, Lebanese Sufi poet Huda Naamani published, she died a couple of years ago, published 1,000 copies of Kitab al-Wajd wa-Tawajud. The translation is Book of Ecstasy and its Indicators. It was her lyrical attempt to communicate her ecstatic experience of the divine in language and crucially beyond language. I read her 145-page illuminated epic, because it really is an epic, as a response to Izutsu's struggle to describe by language, and I quote, the intermediary stage between the absolute and the phenomenal world, and his invocation of triplicity in this Tajalli diagram. So if you'll notice in this diagram, the Tajalli, which is the self-manifestation, is the third element. There is Haq, of course, the real, I'm assuming most people here know these terms, and Mumkinat, the possible. And what I will be talking about today through Huda Naamani's poem, or epic, is the way in which, if she had read his work, which I'm pretty much sure did not, she would have objected to the third element and also to the arrow going in one direction. So in her Kitab al-Wajd wa-Tawajud, Huda does not once mention an intermediary, a separate third that enables a human-divine connection. Rather, the ecstatic experience at the moment of Tajalli braids the human and the divine in a whole of infinitely reflecting mirrors. It constructs the architecture of the barzakh, of ecstasy, where the absolute and the phenomenal world behave as one without intermediary. Now, when I talk about this behaving as one, just recently, for those of you who've been following the Nobel Prizes, of course, the prize in physics went to 3 men in quantum physics who had discovered that Einstein got it wrong when he couldn't understand what the third was, and he said that it was something spooky. And they said, no, it was when 2 units, however far apart, it could be across the world or across the cosmos, they connect without signal and the 2 behave as one. So this is my pseudoscientific explanation of the barzakh, and that will inform my paper. I begin with the title. The first term is Wajd, ecstasy. The second, Tawajud, the indicators or dalalat of ecstasy. She has a different definition of Tawajud than many others. And crucial in the absence from the title is Wujud, being or God. So this is a book about Wajd, ecstasy, Buddha's experience of ecstasy at the moment of Tajalli, or God's self-manifestation. And yet she writes, Wajd is a state that cannot express itself. Hinted at in the only possible writing, namely the Tawajud, the indicators, whose words resonate across the silence of the barzakh of ecstasy, to the silence of being. It is amplified in sound and color. Over 145 pages, Huda penned and painted her ecstatic experience through and beyond language to sound. Why sound? The way Huda arranged the lines on the page and repeated words and phrases in staccato form compel a reading, I believe, that is heard and even chanted, whether aloud or in one's head. Now, I'm going to have to turn around. Is it okay if I turn around? Okay. So I wanted to read some of this to you, and even if you don't read Arabic, hopefully you'll be able to hear some of this, what I've called staccato repetition. So, قل إنه قل نحن قل ليس هو قل لا قل هو قل هو الحق قل هو الحق أبدا ما شئت ما شئت ما تشاء قل لا هو قل منه. And then on the left في القلوب لما فيها من سحر هذا في الصمت لما فيه من صمت هذا في الصبر لما فيه من صبر هذا, and so on. I hope you begin to have a sense of the almost incantatory nature of this language. So the repetition beyond the intoxicating sound it produces may also be semantic. Again and again, Huda calls on God for help, inspiration, and guidance, using derived form 10 ista verbs of entreaty to create consonants. These prayers read like an incantation, like a dhikr. The aesthetic dhikr effect recurs and organizes the impulse deep within the poem in such a way that the words supply the music of dhikr that at that point can be performed. The entire epic poem echoes with the sounds of her prolonged munajat lo-nutha. It's what she calls the munajat, heart conversation with God, but she says munajat lo-nutha, so very much aware of herself as a woman, in conversation with God. So Huda carefully marks the pronominal suffix, the masculine fatha for God, ka, and the feminine kasra for the female interlocutor, ki. God, I said, Huda, your name is the truth, truth. And God replies, I am the truth. This goes on again and again. She will say something and God will repeat it. In the barzakh of ecstasy, she hears God's words that tell her that her fana has become baqa. She will never again be as she had been before her ecstatic experience. Later, she wonders whether this experience, as in an echo chamber, had been real or imagined. Was it really God who spoke to her? Or was she the one who had articulated the words and then heard the echoes of her own words in her chants, the chants that come before the writing? Like Halaj, over a millennium earlier, she asked God twice, am I or are you the truth? Is hers a heresy of the kind that cost Halaj his life? Or, as Fatima Keshavarz observes, is it the power of poetry to overlook canonic conventions and adopt unorthodox schemes? The theme of her slaughter at God's hands pervades the munajat lo-nutha. Like Abraham's dream about slaughtering his son, God dreams about slaughtering Huda, and she calls herself the chosen Dhabiha, the chosen one to be slaughtered. And then from beyond the barzakh of ecstasy, God beckons her to a death in life, wound in a shroud and drenched in blood. Human and divine reciprocate. The immanent God needs Huda to call upon him, for without her call, he would end, at least for her. As he had once asked Adam, Alastu bi rabbikum? Am I not your Lord? God now asks Huda if she's experienced his presence. And God says, you saw me. Did you not see me? You heard me. Did you not hear me? These lines, of course, for many of you will know, echo in Hadith Qudsi, where God describes himself as a hidden treasure. Desiring to be known, he created the world that it might know him, and also that he might see himself in the mirror of creation. And these mirrors are at the heart of my talk. God's call to Huda to acknowledge him by affirming her vision and hearing recalls the primordial covenant. And Huda asserts that she has indeed witnessed him. I saw you when your face flooded my face. I heard you when your voice erased my voice. I heard you, I saw you while the universe slept. Like Adam before, while the universe slept, she alone saw and heard him and the world. Or was it she who exploded into the kun of creation? Like all spiritual searchers, Huda longs for annihilation, and God promises, in the time to follow, you will live through my living. You will dwell through my dwelling, see through my seeing. When I saw your face, God says to her, I drew you to me. I opened your breast. I removed doubt from your heart. I made it a throne for me. Obviously, this resonates throughout Sufi poetry. So in the polished mirror of her heart that he had just opened, God removed doubt and moved in there. This feminine heart conversation with God intensifies at the end of the poem when God instructs her to persist in ishq, divine love. Human love is the manzila, the way station. And she writes, so here he said, وَلَازِمُكِ الْعِشْقِ الْحُبْ مَنْزِلَةً اللَّهُمَّ إِنَّكِ see the kasra, Allahumma inni. O God, it is you, feminine. O God, it is I. So is someone other than God being addressed? How can the invoked God, Allahumma, be feminine, unless it is God calling on the feminine in God, or God calling on Huda? Or is this a call and response in the echo chamber of the barzakh of ecstasy, where the human and the divine behave as one? Back to our quantum physicists. At the height of Tajalli, the experience of ecstasy, Huda is annihilated. And she enters what Rumi once called the still point of ecstasy. We are beyond words. Returning from the silence of the barzakh of ecstasy to tawajud, the only space of writing, as I've mentioned before, but where words indicate beyond themselves, she glorifies God who is all. In her witness to God's majesty, she invokes the day of Al-Lastu, the day before God said kun, the day before creation, when there was nothing but he. Using the words available to her in Tawajud, she writes Nagarjuna's paradox, the paradox of expressibility, to say the unsayable. But for Huda, communication is not only linguistic. She painted while she was writing, while she was chanting. I knew Huda well. And in her, I call these cloud paintings, cloud barzakh paintings. In her cloud barzakh paintings, imagined while in ecstasy, Huda communicated the silence beyond silence of God. These paintings progress from creation to annihilation, and I quote Nader, Ardalan, and Lale Bakhtiyar when they talk about the purposeful use of color to put order where otherwise chaos might exist in the mind of the beholder. So in this painting that I see as the Big Bang of Kun, it's the beginning of her ecstasy. The atoms of the cloud dust, the haba, are in constant reciprocal construction through and in the cloud to prevent the natural tendency toward chaos. In the next painting, and I'll go to it and then come back, is a painting of Huda whirling in the cloud. And next to this painting is this. Zuhur wa duwar, ruku' wa duwar, sujud wa duwar, sumud wa duwar. Again, I hope you hear the repetitions. So, manifestation and whirling, kneeling and whirling, prostrating and whirling, eternity, sumud, steadfastness and whirling. So here we see her whirling in the cloud above her maroon signature, which is in the corner there. You can see on the right, it's the ha. She uses the ha, which of course is Ru'ullah, many sacred connotations. And at the moment of Tajalli, flashes from the polished mirror in her heart, glint gold that reflects back to the mirror in the divine, hinted at the daubs of deep purple. This is the moment that constructs the human divine hall of mirrors. The polishing of the mirror in the heart and soul brings divine and human perspectives together. And to quote Michael Sells, the identity between human and divine is realized in the image in the polished mirror, and the identity of both human and divine is constituted within the image. So in this painting that I read as the Lawh Mahfuz, the bright letters of the red and gold and a large brown moon dance on the page. This image suggests the preserved tablet in heaven that Huda imagines when she writes, and I quote, writing on the tablet before the tablet was created. So the writing on the tablet in heaven is before the words were revealed in words, in spoken words, to Muhammad, and of course the actual writing came so much later, and she's playing on this throughout the epic. She is painting the writing before writing of this tablet, on which the Quran was inscribed before its oral revelation to Muhammad. Huda has painted the primordial writing that preceded even the celestial words on the preserved tablet. Is this her way of sharing her own experience of writing before writing? And the bent black line, see at the bottom, the beginning of her Huda, puts her into the painting. So the last cloud barzakh painting, Anta al-Maut al-Urjuwani, you are the purple death, is purple shot through with gold, illustrating Huda's verse of annihilation that ends the poem that I read to you earlier. The mirror of the enlightened human's heart and soul reflects gold to and from the purple in the mirror of the divine. Addressing God toward the end of the poem, Huda writes that he is the purple mirage, the purple torment, the purple scream, the purple death, al-Maut al-Urjuwani. During Tajalli, while in the barzakh of ecstasy, bringing together Tawajud and Wujud as one, there is no third, but only a mise en abîme, with the infinite interplay of reflections framed within each other, frame within frame within frame. Without a signature, Huda has become one with the cloud, the mirror of the divine. The barzakh of ecstasy in this poem projects a principle that holds and is held in the dynamic anthropic interaction of the reflections from and to the divine and the human mirrors during Tajalli, but importantly beyond. Unlike many theorizations of Sufi experiences of Tajalli, Huda does not resolve the apparent contradiction between human and divine that appears in Tajalli with a third separate element of space, but rather with a mise en abîme. Izutsu's triplicity is not an answer to the conundrum of the non-contradiction of contradictions. While in munajat with God, attentive to the sound of his voice and the color of his words, she is suspended in the barzakh of ecstasy. Her bain al-bain wal-bain, between the between and the between, or min bain wal-bainuna, from between and betweenness. You see there, mizon abim of betweenness, articulates that single ecstatic state of betweenness where the human and the divine behave as one. In conclusion, intertwining dancing, painting, praying, writing, and chanting in an endless loop, Huda builds a frame for the mysterious, mystical experience that cannot be expressed in letters on a page, only in the sounds that echo before, out of, and beyond language, and in the colors of the barzakh paintings. Huda's architecture of the barzakh of ecstasy holds tawajud and wujud in tension, reflecting each other infinitely in the mizon abim of, and I quote, from her, the ecstasy of what was never nor ever will be found. Across and in a mystical state that cannot express itself, Huda has constructed a sentient structure, a human divine hall of mirrors that connects and simultaneously separates the expressible indicators and the ineffable being in infinitely recurring sequences of reflections and echoes that construct the architecture of the mizon abim. Sound and color fill in the silences that stop the pen. The poetic structure of Huda's barzakh of ecstasy stretches into infinity. Hers is an extinction with multiple traces, a transcendence lingering in the shadows of existence. Thank you.
How I became involved with the two of them on this invitation. It really has to do with this incredible personality, this figure, Professor Toshihiko Izutsu. So I have titled this Toward the Transcendent, Reflections on Toshihiko Izutsu. In this reflection, Professor Izutsu's deeply learned and patient world search for core common grounds in key patterns of mystical and metaphysical thought between Oriental, Persianate, Islamic, and Western worldviews opened new pivotal vistas for a meta-historical dialogue in the domain of comparative philosophy for the contemporary Islamicate cosmopolitan world. How noble was his quest! With what brilliant transcendent scholarship and exquisite aesthetic vision did he express his inevitable realizations. However, until 1972, Toshihiko Izutsu was unknown to me, a complete ignorant that I am. But by strange work of fate, an expression Izutsu loved to use at times, on one glorious August morning in Ascona, Switzerland, at the annual Eranos conferences, I found myself witnessing his brilliant presentation of the paper entitled Color Symbolism in Japanese Aesthetics. Essentially, it dealt with the elimination of color in Zen thought and view of existence. The subtlety, eloquence, and profound simplicity by which he presented a rather complex philosophical notion of color, or as I mentioned, is elimination, as an expression of the Zen soul, impressed me deeply. It was very clear, clear as spring water, yet suggestively evoked transcendent levels of consciousness in me that I had rarely experienced. It was not historical, nor was it technical expose, but a verbal, visual means that directly stimulated a spiritual awakening within me that resonated and continues to resonate within me and my whole being. This is really from 1972. Between 1975 to 78, Toshihiko and his wife Toyo would visit Tehran during the summers, where he taught and researched at the McGill University Tehran branch. And I was so happy to find from conversations today with Rob and Armando that that center still exists. Amazing.
Mm-hmm.
How wonderful that exists. So needed today in Iran. He also, of course, gave brilliant lectures at the Imperial Academy of Philosophy. And also, I was pleased that Rob reviewed with me how that academy still exists in Iran. And some of the students, fellow students as we were then, are actually members of that institute today. Now, the Izutsu lived a very modest, and I have to express this, they lived a very modest life. They lived very near, however, to my house in Tehran, which allowed my wife and I the very unique privilege to occasionally visit them, to privately study and discuss comparative Zen and Sufi aesthetic theories. But Nader, you're an architect. What are you doing in this world? Well, I love Japanese gardens. I love the aesthetic of the raked white stone garden of nothingness of Rwanji. What is that aesthetic? What is that vision that brings that into being? And for me, coming from a world of color, think Esfahan, think Masjid al-Shah, think the Masjid al-Sheikh Rufullah, an exuberance of full color, half rank. So how does a place and a culture of everythingness and a culture that deals with essential nothingness, what brought Izutsu to Tehran? What brought me to Japan? This is what brought me to converse with this man and his wife, and they were a pair, the two of them. They taught me. I'm a very bad student to the extent that I learned. In particular, Izutsu elucidated for some of the visions that he had researched of the 13th century philosopher Ibn Arabi. And he really made Ibn Arabi so much more known and digestible to we in Iran where he taught. And I believe today, to many of us who are interested in the highly, highly complex thinking of Ibn Arabi, but he explains it so beautifully. And he really got me involved with the Hermetic worldview concept, which conceives the universe as composed of a hidden microcosm and a manifest macrocosm, each containing three great divisions: the body, jes, the soul, nafs, and the spirit, ruh. It placed in us a sense of cosmogonic being. The individual in the cosmos, and a meaning with regards to that. Ibn Arabi reminded us that in the traditional metaphysical worldview, particularly in Islamic cultures, all human knowledge is simply viewed as the articulation of human imagination in its awareness and level of consciousness. Everything we know is in ourselves, is in yourself. Because awareness and knowledge are situated inside the self, not outside of it. Thus, reality has these two structural dimensions. The microscale, inner, batin, understood as our enlightened imagination, khayal, and the macro scale, the outer, the zahir, perceived by our sense receptors. It's amazing that really from the Cartesian revolution of I think therefore I am, to the 18th century European of Kant and Hegel and others, we have now taken a position about reality, that reality of being within ourselves and outside of ourselves. It's not necessarily that holistic view which persisted, as like Henri Corbin called participation mystique, a mystical experience and participation in the world. No, that's very nice. That isn't modern thinking anymore, gentlemen and ladies. Please don't think that way or you'll fail. And so we live in this world of mechanistic determinism. But what you heard, the beautiful poem read by a Sufi poet, by another Sufi poet there. Yeah. Interesting. Not for me. I can't get an A in my course by going that way. That isn't what Izutsu was talking about. For me as an architect, and I want to say to you, I am, and I have lived 60 years as a working architect. I do this other stuff because I'm trying to find out what of the creative imagination brings into being for what I could create. I'm not interested in philosophy. I'm not interested in teaching. That's why I keep going from one university to another university to another university, seeking. I'm still seeking. But I want to say, as an architect, this traditional inward spatial orientation, for instance, of the courtyard, hayat, and the outward pivot of the walled paradise garden ball have come to symbolize a duality. Let me go back. Let's just go back. Yeah. I believe that actually we, from the courtyard world, architecture, or tradition, we believe in space. It's space that then needs a container. No, you don't create a container and put in its space. No. There is a consciousness, there is a spirit that is outside, all pervading, and all we can do is to embrace it. Another Western philosopher has said, we really don't know about ultimate reality. All we know is that there is an order in the universe, and it behooves us to be in harmony with it. William James. These are the type of thinkers, until the 19th century certainly, that still existed. I mean, I lived for many years, 40-some years, in Boston and Concord, where Thoreau and all these people live. This is still a part of a tradition of the West that's being eclipsed totally So I'm so happy that there's rare once in a while opportunities to speak about positive space. That's in space. Space is pregnant with the spirit. It doesn't need image. You don't have to form an image. All you have to do is to embrace space, embrace spirit. So I go around looking at beautiful paradise gardens. And I started as an artist. And so I go around drawing in pen and ink the lovely paradise gardens. And for instance, this is the Bab Fin in Kashan, that picture. Architect. Okay, Mr. Architect, so what do you do with a paradise garden? Well, an Iranian businessman, my friend and I were there together, getting our master's degree, he in business school, I in architecture. We come back to Iran. Habib Lajavardi, lovely, wonderful, God rest his soul. He says, Nader, I want to build a Harvard Business School in Tehran. I have just finished the book Sense of Unity, Sufi tradition of Persian architecture. Said, Habib, I will accept, but I want to do it as an experiment from this book that I have researched. He said, why not? We have nothing to lose. In those days, you could do these things. So we built this wonderful paradise garden. At the center is the library, the place of knowledge. There's a gateway, and then there is a fruit orchard. Apples, pears, quince. Every once in a while, pomegranates. And in these spaces around, and you saw the plan, Harvard Business School is based on, the case study. 8 people get together, they have to study, and then they have to report to each other, and then they come to class. So you design the space to meet all those requirements of Harvard. But I met my space desire. Anyway, this place existed from 72 to 78, 79, and then another group came in. But the same group. They said, gee, this place looks like where our madrasas look like in Iran, traditionally. So that place has now become the Imam Sadiq University. It trains the elite of this regime. They all live and pick fruit from this tree. There are lots of things that are beautiful that can be existing as archetypal to whoever you are, if you deal with it at some essential level. Very simple essential level. I haven't given you any huge stuff. It's just simple. You build a garden. You give the sense that a tree grows. It gives fruit. You build the idea that keep continuity, you water the plant. Where was my emphasis? Too many words. In any case, here we are. Back to the concept that intangible space transcends the luxuriant, tangible everythingness of the paradise garden and ultimately leads to a profound realization of the apparent nothingness of phenomenal existence is a meditative, metaphysical vision shared in both Sufism and through Izutsu, I learned, in Taoism. All the way on the other side, we're on this side, we share something. Maybe it's your quantum physics math. This level of supra-sensible intuition is found in Sufism through the meditative experience of Fana and Fana Baba that I'll illustrate. And in Taoism, it is referred to as sitting in oblivion, whose ultimate goal is to experience consciousness of essential nothingness, which they call the way. This concept of inward meditative intuition of reality has inspired the spiritual, poetic, and aesthetic production of traditional Islamic cultures. This is certainly my belief. I've had the pleasure, because of the Ardalan Award, of journeying throughout almost all the Islamic world. We've held these similar conferences. And actually, those who have a metaphysical inclination come up and say, yeah, I agree with that. And those who, of course, have a much more empirical say, that's very interesting. But it's there. It's there through all of our Islamic cultures. It's been at the root of it. And to today, really, the fundamentalism and the Wahhabism, this idea is anathema to that. Although I had the pleasure, as you saw, in Saudi Arabia, of writing the history of the Holy Kaaba and being paid for. No, did I get paid? I don't think I got it. By the Saudi government, although they published the book. Ibn Arabi said, all causality, the self-externalization of the divine, in Arabic, tajalli, is through the divine names. In the incessant renewal of these epiphanies, from instant to instant, meaning life constantly coming into being, dying, going back into being. This important ontological axis brings into our consciousness the quest for the spiritually beautiful dimension of design and planning. For me, this is what excites me. This idea excites me. As an architect, as a painter, as someone who needs matière for expression, I need material for expression. What a beautiful, transcendent, immaterial material, which far too long, and here in my big case, has been overshadowed to the point of oblivion by the materialistic determinism of contemporary philosophical worldviews that dominates the world. If we have problems about global warming, if we have problems about inequality, we have all these things. Capitalism has that. This is where we are. If you can measure it, it exists. If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. But how can you measure the divine? How can you measure the unmeasurable? Let me help here a little bit. One of the greatest architects of the 20th century lived right here, close to us, in Philadelphia. His name was Louis I. Kahn. Yeah. He built the center in Dhaka. He built in La Jolla, the Salk Institute, and many other beautiful, most of them highly transcendent buildings, ascribed by many, and viewed as the 20th century metaphysical architect of America. What did he say? He said a building has to begin in the unmeasurable, in your khiyal, in your imagination. Now this imagination isn't funny imagination. This is levels of imagination. It's called consciousness. This whole thing deals with levels of consciousness. You can look and see all this as Donald Duck, or you can look at this and see, well, what is duck? What makes things fly? What is flying? How does my imagination fly? It is consciousness. Today, so many beautiful things being written about consciousness. Consciousness, question that's raised is, does consciousness actually precede existence, or do we have to live with a Darwinian view? No, existence creates consciousness. How can you from a lower form create a higher form? How is it possible? These are questions of consciousness. It's all about levels of consciousness, quality, aspects of consciousness. So, I want to talk about the fact, and I already have, of how this kind of view can bring buildings that have some, now I can't say it, others have described that this place has qualities of Balzac, of this in-betweenness. Some have said, well, yes, because of the traditional architecture and it holds Harvard Business School, so it's in between those two. But others have no. It's this idea that you can build something in this phenomenal world that gives you. How can you have a Harvard businessman student get up early in the morning, go and pick fruit, and still these guys, with their turbans, go and pick the same fruit? What's the commonality? So, almost to the end, guys. I want to tell a very personal story about an exam I had to endure beautifully, lovingly. So it's the story of the I Ching koan that I'm going to tell, and then yeah, I know. I was over. A concluding reflection may well illustrate the art of Professor Izutsu's pedagogy. The private sessions with both the Izutsus dealt with a deeper series of personal instructions of the unveiling of the esoteric interpretations and meanings of the ancient I Ching, the Book of Change Suits. As my final exam of sorts, Professor Izutsu had posed for me a koan, the Japanese riddle, in the form of a visual riddle result. The challenge was to integrate on one diagram the pre- and post-heaven systems of the I Ching, which he had meticulously explained to me. Bad student that I am. I took notes. It seemed the most perfect, however, spiritual level to offer an architect, and one that I was informed, he said, had never been actually solved. That gave a lot of courage to me. I willingly took the challenge, however, not fully realizing the degree of profound difficulty it entailed. I shared very early sketches and drafts with the Izutsu, and they always encouraged me to, and corrected me as necessary to continue the quest. In our last meeting in the summer of 1978, on the eve that I was departing to go teach at Harvard, I had prepared a large hand-drawn black and white ink drawing composed of a circular mandala that had carefully, in my view, integrated in one diagram these two systems. With some trepidation, I unrolled this drawing in front of him and presented it to him, hoping for his confirmation. He looked at it, inspected it quietly. No, was his only firm reply. Deflated, a prolonged silence followed while I gathered my emotions, trying to console myself by remembering the Nader koans are meant to stimulate the quality of your consciousness, not to actually solve anything. Then very quietly, however, as a teacher, a good teacher, with a sense of very deep emotion, Professor Izutsu confided in me that he had actually intentionally posited that particular assignment to me to help clarify for himself, in his own mind, his own personal search for an appropriate expression of the contemporary representation of the I Ching mandala. Oh, that gave me a lot of courage. So I listened very intently. Izutsu never was very casual. Good teacher, distant. Even better teacher, atypically of his pedagogic style, he shared an interpersonal tension with me. This is to indicate this whole business of that research, of the Eastern. In my own self, he said, I have moved between my Zen Buddhist background, in which there is a motion away from the mandala image or any concretization of science. And the beauty inherent, however, in the mandala as a cosmogram of the diagram of the reality of the world. Professor Izutsu paused, as though thinking to himself, I wish to move between a commitment to the mandalic form and for its elimination. His eyes suddenly flashed as though visually illuminated, revealed to him from the imaginal world, from the Ilama Mathal. He went on to creatively describe a dynamic image of this mandala. Thus, the mode of expression must be such that the line expressing the mandala must be and yet must not be. There must be as much obstruction of light while allowing light to bless the blank tablet. Solid line, broken line, raised, embossed. Clue was embossed, white lines on a white tablet, which could cast a shadow in the morning. Side rising sun casts shadows. Or no shadow at noon must be the form most appropriate. With those magical words, the evening came to a close as we held each other's hands to say goodbye, each sense that we may probably never meet again. Though that elegant image of the mode of expression has forever lingered in my imagination. Forgive the corny. So this is what came out to listen. Outer rings, the post, inner rings, the three different levels of interpretation of the I Ching. Interpreted as after image, as diagonal image, as reciprocal. So I promise you a final bow. Thank you very much.
By having in front of you all the indications of what I'm going to say and summarizing as much as possible. So I start out by saying, where do I begin? In the position of a third presenter in a panel which challenges the idea of a third. So what can I do but invoke Barzakh epistemology as Nader has done before me? He quotes from our conclusion at the beginning of his presentation in a previous version that I read. We urging us to a new planetary vision that simultaneously de-emphasizes regional and linguistic essentialism and stresses instead a fuzzy Barzakh logic conjoining religion and culture. So let me expand that plea by raising a still larger question. How do we use terms that are framed in one language but have not only meaning but resonance in other languages across geographic and cultural divides? I might rephrase the question in using the term most prized by Nader, and if any of you have ever known him, you know that he doesn't use one thing, he uses 1, 2, 3 things, but he always uses them aligning with each other. So his constant signature is towards the transcendent. I call it the triple T option from Nader. As an aside, anyone who's ever been in touch with him has seen this. I call it also the embodiment of Hermes Trismegistus, always signing TTT toward the transcendent. So I'm only going to help reassign what he says repeatedly in his own invocations. How do we define the term transcendent itself in a way that transcends cultural differences, linguistic challenges, generational disparities, as also regional historical rivalries, and do it in 15 minutes? I won't make it, either the goal or the timeline, but I'll try. So this query has been posed by philosophers and scientists, theologians, sociologists. I couldn't act as sociologist with Armando here. Theologians and sociologists, and also essays and poets, remembering Huda and Miriam, invoking Huda, have to invoke poets, but also artists and architects, and of course that's a tip to Nader, Ardalan. All these people for centuries, for millennia, have pondered the notion of what is the transcendent. And I will narrow my own inquiry, pivot toward Izutsu, whom I also had the privilege of meeting, and I can't add anything to the stories, the wonderful stories that Nader's told, but I can say that Miriam and I once had him in our home. And that itself is such a delight and a memory that if I were to talk about it, I would only exceed my limit, I would maybe exceed your patience. So I'll leave that for another time. But just to say that knowing Izutsu is almost greater, and certainly is a greater enhancement to reading him than just reading the works that he has marvelously written in so many languages. And what he's attempted to do is to wrest meaning from so many texts in so many languages. I think someone said he knew 32 languages, to which my question was, all at the same level, or were some more or some less? But anytime you can count to 32 and say, you know, some level of them, it's extraordinary. And he did this across Asia and across the world, across the Indian Ocean. And so I view Izutsu's own learning as an essential building block, even when we come to conclusions that I sometimes do, that may differ from his. So I think the greatest dissatisfaction for anybody is to ignore them, but the second dissatisfaction is to cite them and agree with them. So I try the third one, which is to cite them and occasionally disagree. So my own reflection is limited to only one piece of Izutsu's huge academic and publishing paragraph. The Sufism and Taoism book, which I have read over the time for years and reread in preparation for this conference, and realizing that it is like that endless well, or like the meson of being, the more you see it, the more it replicates itself, and the more you have to keep coming back to it to try and find the thread of influence or of outcome that will work for yourself. Okay. So, I'm very much taken with the book that Armando Salvatore and Toshihiko Izutsu, the books they have written in their introduction about Izutsu, where they observe that not obsessed by the genealogical urge to deconstruct religion, the topic religion or the category religion as such. Izutsu's approach inspires scholars to instead probe, what else? Ideas of immanence and transcendence. And to probe ideas of immanence and transcendence through mutual mutations across civilizations and epochs. In other words, Izutsu shift attention, as they say, towards the linguistic, semantic, and geocultural conditions of articulation of religious phenomena. In short, and for those of you who study religion, you know that one approach is the phenomenological approach, but Izutsu's is the phenomenological study of religion, to quote Miriam, who's quoted the latest Nobel Prize laureate in physics, the phenomenological study of religion as an entangled phenomenon. In other words, Izutsu anticipated not only the Nobel Prize, but many other advances in science. This idea of religion as an entangled phenomenon is advanced by Izutsu's constant engagement across multiple traditions with Sufism and Taoism for one stop in his lifelong quest. And so what I focus on in my own very brief intervention and contribution to today's gathering is the way in which he talks about the word essential and essence in his book, Sufism and Taoism. The importance of relationship between the essence and existence cannot be underestimated. The two together, essence and existence, are staged as the absolute and its self-manifestation. Miriam showed this in terms of the Haq and Tajalli, which I won't repeat here. But their Haq and Tajalli in Sufism and Taoism becomes a process of constant returning to the way, which was also mentioned by Nader in his talking about Izutsu's reflection on Taoism and Zen Buddhism. Returning to the way, so much that, quoting Izutsu, existence comes into being for non-existence, which is the abysmal depth of the absolutely unknown, unknowable way itself. So we don't have essence per se, but we have instead the abysmal depth of the absolutely unknown, unknowable way itself. So is this return then to the essence? I would argue no. And quoting Izutsu again, all things in his view on the deeper level of reality are essenceless, not essentialist, but essenceless. The world itself is chaotic. And in a parallel to chaos theory, another modern scientific development that has appeared and I was really astonished when I was trying to say, how did Izutsu ever come to the idea of chaos? I went back and read that chaos theory was already invented by someone in Kyoto, Japan in the 1960s, but his teacher suppressed it. Did not allow him to come out because it was too radical. But Izutsu obviously must have understood this, if not from the individual himself, at least from his own explorations of chaos and chaotic theory. Because he goes on to develop at length what chaos and a chaotic world mean in metaphysical terms. And in the penultimate chapter of his book, Taoism and Sufism and Taoism, it's titled Essence and Existence. His Taoist epigons, Lao Tzu and Xuanzhi, argue for a true picture of things in themselves that is anti-essentialist, and is, to quote Izutsu, empirically chaotic while still maintaining a unity in existence. It's an anti-essentialist, so there's no essence. Reality is empirically chaotic while still maintaining a unity in existence. So what is really real? This is quoting Izutsu towards the end of his book. What is really real is existence with a capital E, nothing else, and the essences with a small e look as if they were real only by dint of the actualizing activity of that existence. I think it's one of the more profound reflections in a book that's teeming with them. And so I try and unpack this a little bit. In a remarkable somersault, the final chapter called The Self-Evolvement of Existence, Izutsu omits any reference to essence, except for one brief reference to Ibn Arabi's allusion to the prior existence of the divine name. It's a whole other subject which I'll avoid here. In talking about the essence of the absolute or the mystery of mysteries. That's on page 489 of the conclusion of his book. Instead, Izutsu turns to other key terms to stress the absolute as at once mystery and darkness, but always through images that convey existence, so that even, and quote for those of you who know Nafs al-Rahman, the notion of the breath of the immersible, it becomes an equivalent of opposites in existence. And again, to quote Izutsu on page 489, what is meant by both mercy and non-mercy is nothing other than the all-pervading creative activity of existence. So I agree with Nader Ardalan, that his Izutsu's comparative study of metaphysics, thought systems, of Sufism and Taoism revealed the potential of meta-historical dialogues, and I stress, meta-historical dialogues that exist on common grounds between traditions of East and West. But to the extent, I ask further, the extent that this dialogue is grounded in the empirical distinction of two thought worlds, it also reveals the limits of historical dialogues. In other words, you must always count with the context in which they appear and the language that's used to describe it. So consider for a moment engagement with third that occupies Miriam Cooke toward the end of her paper, the one you just heard, the Barzakh of Ecstasy, explicating the quest that absorbed and motivated Lebanese writer, artist, mystic Huda Naamani. Miriam notes that the image of mirrors is central to Huda's argument. For her, the Barzakh of Ecstasy cannot be disentangled from the mutually reflecting mirrors of Tawajjud and Wujud, common to all striving. And this circles back to Izutsu's wrestling with existence essence, where tajalli or self-manifestation is always a unidirectional arrow from the one being, haf, to the multiple beings, mumkinat, since there cannot or should not be a link to essence. And so the thrust of much Islamicate, the term that I use and it's developed later in other parts of my work, the thrust of much Islamicate is also earlier Greek Andalusian, early European philosophy. It's on the relationship of thought, to use terms from Arabic and Persian, Turkish vocabulary, thought or essence to wujud or existence. Izutsu has been influenced, I might even say convinced by his reading of Taoist sources that the original fundamental struggle is not between essence and existence, but between one and many, between unity and multiplicity. As Miriam reveals in a footnote, the crucial quote is, the whole world of being is represented as a kind of ontological tension between unity and multiplicity. But the arrow of tajalli or self-manifestation is always unidirectional, from the haq to the mumkinat, and not to the other way around. In his early unflinching systematic exposition of hypnotomy, Izutsu cites the reliance on vision and metaphor of the mirror as also the metaphor of the hidden treasure, back on pages 224 following, and also going back to page 138 if you're checking on footnotes and references in his book on Sufism and Taoism. But what I feel necessary beyond these quotations is to underscore the progression is always from Sufism to Taoism. I have in a longer expedition of this thought about the fact how differently this book would have been written if it was Taoism and Sufism. But it's Sufism as the linchpin for considering another metaphysical system, which is Taoism, with linguistic and of course, cultural and locational influence from both directions, But I think it's interesting he moves from Sufism down to Taoism, rather than Taoism to Sufism. In effect, Izutsu moves from what I would call Platonic Aristotelian notions of being, non-being, or essence existence, to a Sinitic, that's a brief way for talking about everything that's East Asian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, etc., to a Sinitic vocabulary of preference for existence as a basis for all reflection with, quote, all things on a deeper level of reality and essenceless, the world itself chaotic, re-quoting what I said earlier. It's the flow of his argument, in other words, not the absence of his conclusion, that reveal both the depth of his quest and the difficulty of his effort to find unity that amounts to and underscores equivalence or barzakh, a state that is both and as well as neither nor. So perhaps the most unintentional but unequivocal testament to Izutsu's own perplexity is in the same penultimate chapter on essence and existence. Noting how utterly divergent are two views that he is trying to connect, he admits, and I find it's just an astonishing statement. Page 484. If I had to pick one out of all the book and say, this is the one I want to remember, this is the one I want to focus on, either in this talk or in conversation, it would be the one that follows from 484. This is Izutsu. Surely if one puts these two points of view side by side with each other, one's mind cannot help being thrown into bewildering confusion. To see the one and the many in the one, or rather to see the many as one, and the one as many, this naturally causes what Ibn Arabi calls metaphysical perplexity, or Huda. So to further resolve this, Izutsu goes on to argue for a notion of essence not as derived from the absolute other, or original existence, but rather as potential essences, always with a small e, not fully or visibly real, since, quote, what is really real is existence with a capital E, nothing else. By my count, this assertion is only attributed to Schwanzer. It does not represent Izutsu's own resolution of chaos to a point beyond Huda or bewilderment. But I want to argue, and I'm happy to have anybody disagree with me, or everybody disagree with me, that what Izutsu has done, and done brilliantly, is to plunge us fully, inescapably into the sixth of the seven valleys. And I quote here another Persian mystic who's always concerned with these issues of triangulation, but also of progression, the staging in one's consciousness. So Frida di Natar's Monteplatea, the Conference of the Birds, where you have seven valleys, and the next to last valley, the sixth valley, is not unity, but Huda, confusion, or bewilderment. It's summarized in one recent commentary as follows. The valley of bewilderment, number 6. In this valley, the wayfarer experiences pain and regret. When he enters, or she enters, the language is he, but it could be she. When he or she enters this valley, it's like a new world in which one is in wonder and bewildered. The thought says, behold, the next is the valley of bewilderment. Here pain and regret ever rave and thunder. When the pilgrim in this vortex descends, he or she loses the path in amazement and awe. He or she will say, I know nothing of such riddle. I know not this or that. I'm blank in the middle. So then if the wayfarer or pilgrim or seeker persists, he or she finds the seventh valley. And this is the valley which Nader eloquently spoke in his own conversation with Izutsu, his own reflection as past as an architect, with a deep longing to find and to locate and to describe and invoke the transcendent. The seventh valley is the valley of deprivation and doom, otherwise known as Fana. The seventh valley is the valley of emergence, where the wayfarer loses his or her previous identity and becomes one part of a whole. In Attar's words, the wayfarer drowns in absolute sea of bliss and sees by revelation, says Attar. He was drowned in the absolute sea of bliss, forever is lost, forever is in peace. And if he or she manages to emerge from the ocean, he or she will be gifted to see by revelation. So this is the valley in which, if you're familiar with Attar, out of thousands of birds, only 30 arrive at the court of the Seymour. And so they find themselves, that's the name in the riddle, Seymour. The birds were 30, but also one. And so aware of the need to have time for discussion, and not wanting to leave you in some other valley, I'm hopeful we may gain insight from the 30 birds who arrive at the court of Seymour. And let me conclude by applauding both these earlier presenters, Miriam for her insight that Huda's architecture of Barzakh of Ecstasy holds to legend and wujud and attention. It's ever collapsing them in the intermediary of absolute transcendence. To legend and wujud instead mirror each other infinitely in the mise en abîme of the ecstasy of what was never or ever will be found. And also with a tip of my hat to Nader, for reminding us that to truly understand Barzakh design, we need to begin with a culturally attuned cosmic systemic awareness of the epistemological context and physiology of human existence on both a phenomenal and a spiritual level. To which I can only add the picture of whirling with Huda that Miriam showed, and then my own further hope that there remain many valleys to cross. This is the scan, but knowing that the fire has been lit, we can already feel the heat of its flame. Whether we burn in the fire, as Rumi says, or drown in the ocean, as Atar said, or whirl in the cloud, as Huda did, we're emboldened to journey on with Izutsu as our guide. Thank you.
I just feel that you've been listening to the three of us for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And I would prefer to hear from you. So, is that okay?
Beautiful.
Good, yeah. I mean, questions, comments, but it would be nice if we can engage with you and do that. In case you weren't expecting it, right? Oh, we were going to do a meditation. We could meditate for a minute. Take a minute.
Yes? You want to take a meditation? Let's do it. All right.
Just
And
one
then think
minute.
about what you want to ask.
Just 1 minute.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Welcome back.
I have a rather curious question to both three of you. Do you think Toshihiko Izutsu or Huda, the poet, did they find what they were looking for in Sufi path? Did they find happiness, or they reach Fanafillah in that Sufi path, do you think? Not an academic question, I know, but rather I'm curious.
Shall I?
Sure. Why not?
I think in a way she did, because that's why I wanted to pair that Allahumma innaki, Allahumma inni with that final, the purple death, which is her death, her annihilation, her fana in the divine. And I think what she was trying to do, and I think what was different with her, is that she doesn't throw up her hands in the way that Hallaj did, or Rumi also. I mean, this glorification of silence that can't be expressed. And of course it's expressed because, I can't talk about it, but let me tell you about it. But she doesn't go through that pretense. And I think what's crucial is her speaking with God. And is it me, is it or not? That for her, and I think the painting was absolutely crucial. She was, Majdoub, crazy, but no, not really crazy. I mean, sort of drawn to God, and drawn to God in the chanting of the words that she hasn't yet written. And so I think that she did find a way not only to try to understand what she had been through, but to say the unsayable of Arjuna, and to make it possible for people who read this poetry, which, by the way, she did not share with more than 1,000 people, make it possible for others to begin to get a sense of what that experience is.
I'd just like to say, to the level of Nader Izutsu, this aspect of no mind, the training of no mind, was for him so difficult that then he went to a world of philology that deals with mind, that words deals very much with the word. I don't think that Izutsu's studies in Sufism made him a Sufi. Also, you must know this phenomenon. A good teacher teaches about a way. It doesn't mean that you'll get there, or that actually it is a way. It's the best of what we know as a way to bring what? Inner outer peace. Inner outer peace. To exist and to exist within others. So my sense is that follow these diagrams as a good lesson from a good, great teacher. Don't expect miracles, but they really help. For if you have a creative mind, it's terrific. I haven't found anything as delicious as that. This business that God was a hidden treasure. He wished to be known. To know himself, he created us. This is a story. You don't know. This is a very beautiful story. And my God, can you imagine anything more challenging than that you are God coming to know itself? And that God has no image. But what a lovely thing. You are self-manifesting. And here's another thing. The self-manifesting is not toward the bad. It's the self-manifesting toward the beautiful. Especially in Islam, this is, Muhammad said, God loves beauty. It's key. And this key from the, I would say, the pre-existing Greco world of Aristotle and others that deal with beauty as the sign toward the good and the true. What more do you want in life?
I was going to just say one thing that this has been an experience that I've often had with Nader, that I was thinking how I was going to answer the question, and then he anticipated my answer at the end, but said we can't formulate these things in words, and yet there are elements of it that are performed. And I think the performative element is the fact that it's not merely thought or imagined, but performed. Goes back to the idea that Armando and I have talked about a lot, that you have in the whole Islamic or Islamicate traditions, I prefer to call it, a notion that adab is not only beautiful writing and beautiful things, but it's also beautiful behavior. So there's no notion that there's an independent, isolated observer or a way of being a Goshen Ashin sitting in a corner without participating in the world. So that I myself always think that the word ihsan, which can mean beautiful, also means the good. And the good is not only something you see, it's something you do. And those elements go together, the beautiful and the better. The good, but it's always looking to be the better.
I just this can be a question for any of you, maybe Nader to start, but because we spent the most time with him of the three panelists, but Bruce and Miriam, if you have any insights. So I'm just wondering about Izutsu in the Imperial Iranian Academy of Philosophy, and of course, from my perspective, he's an absolutely brilliant and insightful historian and explicator of the development of key notions of Islamic philosophy, such as essence and existence, which Bruce talked about. But when we think about his formation, we think primarily of his formation in Japan. Did he ever talk about being part of a kind of lineage of Islamic philosophy, where discussions of essence and existence, where he was in a way the latest in a long line of philosophers who had investigated this, and did he place himself in relation to his teachers, Ashtiani, and before him Tabatabai, and before him Satsabari, and before him Mullah Sadra, and before him. Was he just a kind of...
I think, I don't know if you know, I understand, but things people say to you. Izutsu first began this exploration in Japan, and then he went to Europe to find this sort of theme of common ground and the thinking. And so he really began from a Japanese and then a Western intellectual way. When he came to Islam, when he came to study the writers of Islam, he said, God, wow, this is what I've been waiting for. They were confirming what I'm seeking. So I think he found a kindred spirit. So he was beginning in this meditative Zen Buddhism way, and what he was then trying to do to find this common ground, he didn't find it necessarily in Europe. He suddenly felt kindred souls. So the last thing Izutsu was working on when we parted was he was working on Satsabari, and he was a searcher. This was thirsty. He was being quenched by this. He was very, very much deeply interested in what he was finding, that at a high intellectual level, Rob, as you know.
Thank you all for a wonderful set of talks, and in particular, thank you, Professor Cooke, for introducing us to this artist, Huda and Naamani. I was wondering, I may have misheard, but I think that at the beginning of your talk, you alluded to a tension between Izutsu's work and the artistic practice of Naamani. And you didn't really, I think it was implicit in the remainder of your talk, but I wanted to give you a chance to kind of bring out that tension, if you would call it a tension.
Great, so can I read my footnotes?
Sure.
Yeah, Bruce actually, cited part of one of the footnotes. I'm not sure that I would say it was tension between them, but obviously they're very, very different people. Here we have somebody who was a Buddhist, trained as a Zen Buddhist, very particular kind of meditative, reflective tradition. And somebody, and I didn't mention this, who is the great-great-granddaughter of Abdul-Ghani al-Nabulsi. And so she was born into an elite family in Damascus, deeply engaged in Sufism, so as a child. I think what struck me about Taoism, Sufism and Taoism, was obviously such a dive into Ibn Arabi, and so that Ibn Arabi becomes all of Sufism. And that the way in which he dove into Ibn Arabi is very tripartite, and I'm not saying no to three, but I'm saying no to a third, or Huda was saying no to a third, because where I think she takes off from the very short sentence that I cited from him, where he says, well, the intermediary, how can you describe that by language? And where I see her sort of taking that the next step is, well, we can't really do it in language, but actually we can. So it's saying the unsayable, back to Nagarjuna. And when you say it, you're actually you're making the sound, which is why I remember I gave a much longer talk in the Sufi Institute in Istanbul this summer. And I was practicing those 2 pages, and Bruce said, don't read them, they'll think you're nuts. But anyway, so I just read a little bit so you get a sense of it. But I think it's so important in our attempt to go toward the transcendent, to try and understand what that might be, is that language in a way is a law. And so you can do it in building. And that's with your tangible and intangible of the beauty of a structure. You can do it in dhikr, in the sound of words, and it doesn't actually matter too much the meaning. I mean, you can spend, as I assume some of you have, you can spend 2 hours hu Allah, and saying various other things. What matters is the sound and what the sound does to you. And then for her, of course, the sound then becomes part of prayer. That was why a sujud with duwar, ruku with duwar, so that it becomes much, much more expansive. And that's, to go back to your question, where I feel that where he ends up, and this is in the conclusion. So he's done this whole thing on Ibn Arabi, and he's done this whole thing on Taoism, and it's, I have to say I didn't read the Taoism bit. So, but I just read the Sufism bit and the conclusion. And I mean, he ends up saying, I've been talking about the intermediary, but I can't, how can we render the intermediary by language? And so actually Huda's like, right, not just words on a page, but everything else. Does that help?
Yes.
Thank you. I have a question for Professor Cooke. So the poetry and the paintings you projected, on the one hand, you track these thematic continuities with a large pre-modern poets, but the poet, the verse itself, the form, is very modernist, right? As is the painting.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of, I was wondering if you could speak to that, because firstly, how does she fit into Arabic modernism, for example, whether visual or verbal? And is there a kind of perhaps a natural affinity between Islamic languages of unsaying, to use Michael Sells' and the sort of tradition of anti-illusionism we see in Persian painting, right? Some of it in Persian painting, and modernism, right? Would this be a distinct trajectory of a modernist aesthetic in Arabic literature and painting? A trajectory that goes back not to European modernism at all, but to in fact early modern anti-illusionism in Persian painting, as well as older languages of unsaying. So that's sort of that's a query. Because I'm just responding to the fact that despite these continuities, what you actually project looks very modern.
Yes, absolutely. But also, what is very modern in our Western consciousness, in terms of Sufism, well, no, not in terms of Sufism, is actually derived from Sufi writing. And so this stripping down to the essence, the stripping down of language, yes, the way it looks on the page. Now, when you're talking about modernism as a global movement, yes, she was very much part of the Lebanese intellectual community of the 60s, 70s, and through the war. And she did a lot of experimental poetic writing. In fact, when she gave me this book in 1997, you could see that very extravagant, you know, sort of gold paper. I was like, oh God, what is this? Because I was really interested in her writing on the Lebanese Civil War. And that's where I first encountered her as a writer, but also as a person. And yes, very experimental. I mean, the ways that she would, like Etel Adnan, a Lebanese also poet, writer, novelist dealing with the Lebanese Civil War. Very much looking at the page as the blank white, what you were talking about with, you know, the Japanese taking color away and then filling it with white and light that becomes its own intensity for colors to come through it. Was something that a number of them were doing. It's sort of, I think it was the urgency of being there and conscious during the war, and also hoping that somehow what they would write would make a difference, which it didn't really. I'm not really answering your question well. Your question's much better than my answers. Yes.
So I think it's a great question, what directed to me, but I want to just say, in parallel to what Miriam just said, part of what makes Huda such a modernist performer, to use a kind of collective term, is that she's known for poetry, but she's also going to express herself in dance and painting, and she's going to, and also music is implied because the whirling doesn't come without some notes floating in her head. So to me, the parallel to her using another medium besides just poetry, although using words, but using them in an expressive performative domain that's not simply words on the page, is my own favorite icon, who's cited in my books several, right? M.F. Hussein, the painter whom I think you must know of, Vidal Hussein. I'm curious enough, I haven't had a chance to tell Nader my whole biography, but just in the same way I got to know Nader very much in the autumn of my own life. I got to know him in the winter of his life when he was 96 years old, when we went to Qatar in 2010. And one of the things he did, first of all, he took a shine to Miriam, which helped a lot. But besides that, he actually tolerated me as well. We used to have meetings together. And he finally said, I want to give you my book. I said, what book is this? We've got all the different paintings of yours. We know about your paintings. No, I've done this book, which is really not a painting, but it's in poetry. So here's this man, nobody thinks of him as a poet, but he's very much a modernist. And to communicate kind of what, I don't want to use the word essence, unless it's with a small e, the essences or the further demonstration of who he was, he has this extraordinary poem where he has different images, but all in black and white. Nothing in colors, for which he was famous. But in that poem, extended poem, he tells the story of how poetry, painting must be heard.
To be seen.
Painting to be seen. Painting to be seen.
Poetry to be seen.
Poetry to be seen is what it was. Poetry to be seen. So unless you can enliven poetry with actual images or use those images as a source for poetry, you've not been a modernist in the true sense.
Well, I just wanted to remind us that the book, The Spiritual in Art, by Kandinsky, and then the beautiful Los Angeles Museum exhibition called The Spiritual in Art. These are references of the highest order, and I wish that our artists would be creating at that level, and some are. But this is a tradition that is the essence in a lot of the great artists that we have come to love in the 20th century. So spiritual and art. This is what Miriam has brought us to. I want to make one comment before we go. Both of my colleagues, because they talk to each other, and have been criticized in a way, and this is fine, it's criticism, about Izutsu and his diagram that she showed. That you have the sort of Ibn Arabi view, and then you have the Zen view, and the arrow. But I want to say he just didn't read far enough, God damn it. Please go to the final page called 493, and I'm going to read a short paragraph, because he writes and winds all of these things up as a circle, okay? It's a cyclic. It is remarkable that neither in Sufism nor in Taoism is the ontological descent from the mystery of mysteries down to the stage of phenomenal things made to represent the final act of existence. The descent is followed immediately by the reversal, that is ascent. So the 10,000 things flourish exuberantly at the last stage of descending course, and then takes an ascending course toward their ultimate source until they disappear in the original darkness and find their resting place in the cosmic pre-phenomenal stillness. No, Izutsu ends by that. And that diagram was a piece of a diagram, and you have to look at the whole thing. It is not at all dealing with the fact that you have only from above down. That is where the idea that he has dealt with of ultimate consciousness. Yeah, things have to begin somewhere. He's talking about the beginning. He's not talking about then. The next thing that he says is, with each descent, there is an ascent. And so it's a cycle, and this is continuity. This is continuing.
So, actually, Nader pointed to something which I think came out in that last. Nader is very open until he's not. And he shared many things with Miriam, but he said, "You're not going to see the mandala until I show it at the actual event." So we are seeing, as you're seeing for the first time, the mandala. And I'm saying the reason is because it confirms what I've always thought is my deepest understanding of it, is that he is not thinking about Fana and Baqa. He's thinking Baqa, Fana, Fana, Baqa, an endless circle. It's the I Ching, it's the yin yang, it's a constant cycle. What we used to call in philosophy, I don't know whether Barbara would agree with me, Thanasa, the topic of reincarnation, which has a standard meaning, but also has another phenomenological meaning, is the cycles of the world that go and come. And so Fana and Baqa become not just the individual seeker, but the yin and yang of the universe as well.
Exactly.
Is that true?
Beautiful.
I want to make sure I got it right.
Salvatore, do you have?
No. Thank you for this beautiful event and your talks. I'm asking a question that I think you already answered, but I just want to talk more about it. And it's about this term that Professor Salvatore mentioned in the opening, this question of geophilosophy. In some way, Izutsu, as we're reading it, thanks to you and Professor Salvatore these days, presents an alternative to the ways in which Europe or Western modernity as conceptualized Islam. We are thinking that Izutsu is bringing something from the East that allows us to, especially here at the Institute of Islamic Studies, to think differently about Islam. And of course, his presence is somehow felt still in this building. So, can you elaborate a little bit more on how this view from the East of Izutsu is making us see Islam differently, if possible? All of you.
Well, I'll turn it over to Nader or to Miriam, but my first instinct is to say that he is geometaphysical in the sense that he recognizes there are categories of East and West, but also that they're flexible and interactive. So what I think is, when the new book comes out on Izutsu that Armando and Cooke have done, one of the things I underlined in my secret advanced copy of part of it was the notion that Izutsu explodes the idea that there's always East-West dichotomy, but there's a constant circulation of ideas at some level East and some level West. But for instance, the most basic notion of all, Greece, which one could argue is part and parcel, but also is part of the East. It's not part of Europe in an irrevocable sense. Greece is also very much a parallel to a lot of the developments that happen in Asia, because Greece, after all, like all of Europe, is essentially Asian. So East-West is always a comparative category, not a static geographical division between something that's out there off the Pacific Ocean and that has a lot of water and land on it, and part that is a little pond, as it's called, the Mediterranean pond, that defines something that is the West and is the Mediterranean West. So the whole idea there's a Mediterranean Sea and the Pacific Ocean, and that those define East and West, is a kind of false dichotomy or a pseudo-geography. And then for him, it's always the idea of not only where it originates, but how it circulates that defines East and West in his work.
Have you seen this movie called The Eastern that they made of Izutsu's
Yes, I did.
work? One, I mean. And my thought when I saw that, I knew that they had interviewed a lot of people, but I never had seen the movie until Armando brought that movie to my attention. The only reason I raise it is I believe this movie touches on the importance of, in the 21st century, it's about time that we unmasked the 18th, 19th century stranglehold on reality. And he brought to our consciousness that there is this tradition of consciousness in this vast geographic area called the East, stretching from China, Indonesia, India, all the way through Persia to Andalusia. I mean, unbelievable. Nearly 2 billion people, but particularly that eastern portion and its roots of its traditions that deal with this abstract unity that has no image. This is very important, and that is a totality view, whereas modernism has brought, from the time of really Kant and Hegel and others, that you have to separate the secular from the religious. Well, we didn't live that way. It's impossible that the creations of the people that have been addressed today from the Islamic world, that they would come into these views if they had to live segmented, phenomena separate. No, this is cyclically involved with each other at levels of climes. And so I think it's very important. Entire colonialism is based on the dominance that the Western thought of the secular view of things made all of our thoughts outdated. in many ways inferior, in many ways. But now you see this incredible mind. I think it brings its similarities to quantum mathematics. You know, my thought is that Izutsu is a way that brings intellectual self-confidence to those of us from the East to try to deal with reality. And you have a problem because reality in that way that has come to our minds as modernity is based on the measurable. Only the measurable exists. The unmeasurable then is unmeasurable. If it's unmeasurable, it doesn't exist. And the answer is yes. This is the whole story of this view that we exist in a phenomenal dream. And how do you deal with this reality? How do you deal with something which is touchable and yet transcends into things untouchable? Now, I gave you the expression from one of the great architects in America that you design in your mind, in your imagination, something that is unmeasurable. And through the process of designing, technically measuring, you build something. But yet finally when it's done, it's to be judged by its unmeasurable quality. So we in our group plug for a group that is studying. There's only one group in America that is dedicated to the study of the spiritual in architecture, which is a group that I, lovingly participate with. Intellectual, 700 people now around the world that deal with this idea of the spiritual in built form. And we're a research group. We have incorporated as a research group. And so we've been in existence for about 12 years. And my feeling is that these kinds of things can help in this world in which we don't know really what we're doing, except that we're taking it into chaos and cataclysmic conclusion. So these are perhaps helpful directions as an alternative. So I think Izutsu is a very important guy to bring confidence, intellectual confidence to study this.
The only thing I want to add to that is that although I only knew him slightly and I've been really much influenced by him in several dimensions of my work, I still think he was so far ahead of his time that his largest impact is yet to be found, yet to be seen. There's a certain sense that I compare him not lightly with the person who has most influenced me, Marshall Hodgson. Hodgson's own work was practically unread or unnoticed in his lifetime. Many people canceled him out and said, this is, he may be a Quaker pacifist, but he's also dead on other counts, and just dismissed him. And now there's sort of a comeback, rethinking of the global history and the patterns and some of the terminology of Hodgson. But he died in 1968. So there's a sense in which these really seminal thinkers, of whom I put Hodgson and Izutsu in a separate category from most other people, they plant a seed, and the seed grows, and the seed spreads. And Nader is one of the plants that's coming from the Izutsu seed, and he's still growing.
Growing more boring. Okay, I think.
I think there was one question.
Oh,
I
yes.
think we can take 2 questions. We have past 6 o'clock. 6:05.
How is it that the poet experiences that concept, that notion, or is it just a reference? Or is it something that is, so all this to say, it's basically also a way of like understanding how she gets from basically her experience to the writing, essentially.
I think you have to ask Huda. I'm doing my best to sort of try and understand where she is and how she's trying to evoke, record, and make others participate so that if it's intense enough And, if you were to read Kitab al-Wajh wa-Tawajud, you might share my feeling that there is something ecstatic in reading this text. Kind of crazy, as Bruce said, don't read it aloud.
At least
So-
not late at night.
and not to you, okay. I don't know, I mean, so this is an enormously abbreviated paper that I gave here, but whenever she uses urjuweni, the purple, it is the color of the divine, of the highest level of consciousness. I think it's the highest chakra, the crown chakra is purple. And so if we're going to get to sort of a sense of unity that crosses and color that you dealt with Lale Bakhtiar years ago, that there is sort of at least within transcendent practices or languages, there are colors that represent across cultures, excuse me. So she was certainly very much, I mean, there are 9 paintings, and I only dealt with 4 of them, but the green is definitely for Islam. And so there is an entire painting, cloud painting, that is all green, no edges around it at all. And then she says, Anta al-Akhtar, and she's talking to God. So as she's approaching the al-Maut al-Urjuwani at the end, she's been talking to God in various colors, which is why I see the Lawh Mahfuz, that is brilliant colors, the wonderful gold and red and yellow and the big brown noon. I mean, she's working her way through, and she's working us through her experience. And it ends with Allahumma innaki, Allahumma inni.
I just want to say that the color system that Huda is relating to is not the classic color systems that have existed. So there's really maybe 2 or 3. One that ends in luminous black on your meditation. One that ends in green. So purple is somewhat more recent. It's not as prevalent. Of course, this is very personal. This is your meditation, but we're experiencing various artists who go through this and then represent it in that way. I wish she had used less brown, though. I mean,
But that's good. That's good. It's a word.
You'd love to be, motivated. And this thing is all death. It's very, very
God
brown.
is creation.
Well, maybe it was
It's the earth coming out of nothingness, out of
yes, but
the day
earth
understood.
coming out of nothingness and then bursting into roses and power. And I didn't see that. And maybe I
Too
missed
much of
something.
a romantic. It is a romantic.
Well, can we thank everybody?
Yeah, I think